Okay, so on this episode of How Do We Wire It, we are going to be focusing on the wiring of a spark ignition type gas furnace. So what we have here on our screen is, again, another very basic simulation of the components a spark ignition furnace. We have our transformer, we have a fan limit switch, we got a blower, thermostat, our ignition module, our gas valve, and obviously our ignition and igniter assembly. So, like I always say before, anytime you are looking at or wiring something, you have to take a step back and kind of look at the entire picture of what you're actually dealing with. You got to know a little bit about the function of a gas furnace. You got to know the basic layout and what things do and when they're supposed to happen in order to really kind of understand the wiring and the functionality of an equipment that you're actually working on. So with this piece of equipment, again, we're going to begin wiring just our line voltage components first. As I say all the time, it is important to just take things step by step on anything that you're doing when it comes to wiring. Focus on one thing at a time. So, how do we wire this? Well, we have our power source here. We have L1 and L2. All right. We have our primary side of our transformer. We got a blower. Now, as a skilled technician, even an entry-level technician, you should have some understanding that blower motors are powered with line voltage, 120 volts, 208, 230, whatever it is that that unit is receiving, that motor is going to be powered with. You should know that gas valves are wired for 24 volts. Thermostats are most likely wired with 24 volts of electricity. So you should never be wiring anything of those things with 120 volts or anything other than 24 volts. So when we're wiring this, we're going to begin at L1. L1, and I want to power up my primary side of my transformer, because that's the simplest thing to do. I know that my primary side is always going to be receiving my source voltage. In this case, it looks like maybe 120, maybe 208, 230. Okay, because of the L1, L2. I'm also going to power up my fan side of my fan limit switch. My fan side is my normally open side. This switch here is going to close once my furnace reaches approximately maybe 140 to maybe 150 degrees. So I'm going to come out and I'm going to power up that side of my fan limit switch. Remember, fan limit switch is nothing more than two switches that are wired in parallel. Okay? So I'm going to come out of my switch and I'm going to power up my blower. I'm going to come out of my blower and I'm going to come right back to my neutral, or my L2, just like that. Okay? Now, believe it or not, you are complete with your 120 volt side of the circuit. It's kind of crazy to kind of think of, but you are honestly done with that wiring portion of it. Everything else is operating off of the 24 volt side. Okay, so what we're going to do here is we're going to start at our transformer, our secondary side. Okay? So I'm going to come out of my secondary side of my transformer, just like so, and I'm going to power up my thermostat. Remember, R is always my power on my thermostat. I am then going to power up my white. Okay? Out of my W, which is my heating circuit, I am now going to power up my normally closed side of my fan limit switch. My normally closed is my safety. That switch is going to open when my furnace reaches an unsafe temperature, probably somewhere around 200 degrees. At 200 degrees is the magic number. If it gets that hot, that switch is going to open. But what do I want that switch to control? In many cases, that limit switch is going to control my ignition module, which is right down here. Okay, so I'm going to come out of that side of my switch, and I'm going to power up my TH, my thermostat. That's what I always like to use as association. Thermostat begins with TH. So I'm going to go TH. My TR, I like to think of transformer. That is going to go back and complete the circuit of my transformer. So I'm going to come out, and I'm going to go right back to my secondary side of my transformer. I have now completed my safety circuit of my entire gas furnace. Now all I need to focus on is my gas valve, making sure that that's wired correctly. I need to make sure that my igniter is wired correctly. Now what's nice about a lot of ignition modules, they are pretty much plug and play. They are pretty much labeled, and they kind of tell you what wire goes where. Like for example, here on this ignition module, I have an igniter terminal, I have a ground terminal, I have a pilot valve terminal, I have a pilot valve MV pilot valve terminal, and then I have a MV terminal. So it's basically nothing more than plugging and playing. So what we're going to do is we're going to do our igniter. Okay, we're going to use a nice dark red. My igniter is going to simply get wired right to my igniter, just like this. This is a spark plug. That's basically all a spark ignition system is. It's nothing more than a spark plug. And I'm going to use that spark to ignite the gas. But with a typical spark ignition system, my igniter has to be grounded. If I don't have a proper ground on my ignition module, like I'm doing here, my ignition module isn't going to operate properly. It's not going to receive the correct signals from my furnace to tell whether or not it actually lit or not. And what we call that signal, it's called flame rectification. When I generate a spark and I have a flame, that spark igniter becomes a flame sensor. And the only way that I'm able to understand and know whether or not I actually ignited gas is through my ground signal. That ground wire sends a signal back to the ignition module saying, hey, whether or not I actually lit or not. Excuse me. Okay, that is a real important part about a lot of your ignition modules is they need to be properly grounded. Okay, follow your manufacturer's recommendations on how to properly ground an ignition module so that they actually work correctly. Now, With my gas valve, that is really, again, it is nothing more than just simple plugging and playing. Okay? My pilot valve is simply going to get wired to my PV. Pilot valve. My main valve gets wired accordingly. Oh, excuse me again, sorry. My MV goes to my MV. And now my PV and MV is basically my common. It's just my wire that connects back to my module so that I have a complete circuit. Okay, and I'm just going to use this shade of blue. That just comes in like that and right back in. So really the sequence of operation of a spark ignition system is that once the thermostat calls for heat, that signal gets sent down into the ignition module through the TH terminal on that ignition module. Once that call is received, the ignition module will now send that power out to my igniter and to my gas valve, which will now ignite my pilot valve if we have a pilot light that needs to be established first. Once that pilot is established, that signal gets sent back to the ignition module, telling the ignition module that you have a pilot lit now. That ignition module will now send out the power to my main valve on the gas valve, which will then ignite the main burners. Once the main burners are lit, the furnace will now begin to heat up at around 140 to maybe 150 degrees. My fan side of my fan limit switch will now close. That's this contact right here. That switch will close, and it will now in turn turn on the blower. The blower turns on. I am now circulating that warm air into the space where I can now begin heating it. And that's how you wire a spark ignition system.